In the dark world of underground hip hop, we seem to see the same stories told over and over again of artists who have all the potential in the world, yet lose their shot at making it to the top through either label mismanagement, mental health issues, or passing before their time. In fact, we now live in a time where artists basically have a 3-year expiration date on their careers, and if they're not constantly pushing themselves in your face, they begin to fade away. Hip hop as a genre, or in fact, the entire music industry as a whole, is becoming less and less about the actual music and more about who can make the loudest noise, who can have the most antics, and who can do the most to keep themselves in the news. But despite this constantly changing landscape, there is one artist who stands out from everybody else. Somebody who's lasted over 10 years in the game without much controversy, without getting into any trouble, any horrible allegations. He's somebody who's basically only ever focused on his music and his craft. And that man is Denzel Curry, an artist who's managed to make timeless music, change the entire game, and stay consistent throughout his entire career, despite all the tragedy that has rocked his life over and over again. Now, without further ado, guys, this one is long overdue, so let's get into it. The story of Denzel Curry. But before we get into that, I do want to give a quick shout out to my Patreons. I'm going to read all their names at the end of the video, so stick around for that and find out how you can become one as well. But without further ado, for real this time, let's get into it. Denzel Ray Curry was born February 16, 1995 in Miami Gardens, Florida, born into a family of 4 boys, of which he was the youngest, which would soon become a blessing and a curse for him, because of course the neighborhood that he grew up in that was nicknamed the Zoo was a pretty dangerous hood, and because of that, all 3 of his older brothers would become involved in the street life in attempts to help feed the family. But luckily for Denzel, being the youngest, he never had to get involved himself, which gave him more time to focus on his hobbies, which at the time was mostly art, telling his mother at a young age she wanted to grow up and be an artist, which his father was supportive of, but his mother, not so much. But it's not like art was his only interest, because of course, being a kid growing up in the 90s, he was a pretty avid skateboarder, he played a lot of video games on his N64, he liked to read comic books, and of course, watch anime, which were all themes that would eventually find their way into his music, which was actually pretty unique at the time, because during the 90s, basically all the hip-hop was about the street life, being gangster, and everything related to that, which was definitely cool for a young kid, but there wasn't a whole lot of relatable factors for the average person. So Denzel being more accepting of his nerdier side would help a lot of people identify with his music, and because of that, he would gain more longtime fans. But that's not to say that Denzel wouldn't be around any violence during his childhood, because unfortunately his cousin would pass away in a shooting, as well as one of his childhood best friends dying across the street from his aunt's house, so there was definitely violence around, he just never got involved in it himself. But as always, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, because Denzel wouldn't even think about making music until the 6th grade. He was doing poetry for quite a while, but it was only after he met a friend at the Boys and Girls Club that would often challenge him to freestyles and also beat him over and over again that he would finally decide to start working on his own raps and challenging him back. With the two of them even freestyling over MySpace, basically writing out the bars to diss each other and then sending them back and forth, which of course would only help Denzel work on his pen game even more. When it came to the rest of school, it doesn't seem to be all that eventful. He never really speaks about it too much, besides the fact that apparently he was bullied a little bit, with somebody even punching him in the face at one point, which would inspire him to start getting into martial arts and learning how to defend himself. Not to mention that his older brother was actually a backyard boxer, and a pretty talented one at that, even getting in a documentary about the whole sport, so fighting definitely ran in the genes. But at the same time, Denzel was a pretty peaceful guy, often joking around, not really taking himself too seriously, and being able to vibe with almost everybody. With him even saying at one point that he never works with people that aren't his friends, so basically everybody he's collaborated with he actually messes with, and that's a pretty good roster of friends to have. As Denzel grew older, his musical taste would start to change with him becoming interested in artists like Kid Cudi, MF Doom, and Andre 3000. Not to mention his older brother was actually an artist as well that went under the name Soldier Moon. And because of all this influence, Denzel would finally write and record his first ever track in 2010 called 95 Till I Die, 94 Till I Go, featuring Halo Kid. This song was named after both of the years that the boys were born, and after listening to it, you can definitely feel that MF Doom influence, which isn't too bad actually for a 15-year-old, it's pretty solid.
Bunch of ass on my Jedi master, they call me priesthood, but I ain't the pastor.
But of course, their production value on it's not very good, as it was most likely recorded in their bedroom, but despite that, there is a lot of promise in it, and you could tell that Denzel had talent from a young age. Now, tracking down any of his music prior to 2011 is a hard feat to do, because of course he wasn't yet posting on SoundCloud, instead posting on miscellaneous websites as well as YouTube, and he also took a lot of it down. But luckily there was one mixtape from the period that would resurface online called Curry Was Here, when he was going under the name PH Curry, which I'm not really sure if was a nickname or an actual alias of his, because one interesting thing about Denzel is that he'll come up with a new character for every album he drops. At one point he was the Aquarius Killer, then he became Ultimate Denzel, then it was Zeltron.
Before my rap name, it was Denzel Aquarius Killer Curry.
He was an Aquarius killer.
I'm an Aquarius. Oh,
And
gotcha.
he's a killer.
I believe he does this because he wants to put himself in a different mind frame for each of his projects, taking on a different character that has different thoughts and feelings than himself, so everything comes out in a different way. After all, Denzel is definitely a very artsy person. Although when listening to his very first project, you're really not going to get a whole lot of sense of what he was going for creatively. It was basically a project that he made in his bedroom at the age of 15. Once again, the production's not all that good, but luckily for Denzel, it wouldn't be long before he left his bedroom and started recording music at the Zoo Mansion, which was of course owned by Metro Zoo. Now, if you haven't heard of these guys, I wouldn't blame you because they're definitely pretty forgotten by today's standards, but at the time in 2011, they were pretty important figures in the underground scene. Now, at the time, this group was comprised of 4 members, with the leader and founder being Lofty 305. You also had another rapper named Ruben Slick, who a lot of people want me to do a video on, maybe someday. You also have Posh God, as well as Poshkernaut, who were both producers that Denzel would continue to work with through the rest of his career. Now, at the time, he wasn't a full-on member, but he would often go over to their house and spray paint, do art, and of course, record music. And he eventually got so interconnected with them that when they made the mixtape Mink Rug, he would actually get a couple features on it, as well as another pretty infamous underground rapper appearing on the project known as Space Ghost Perp. Now, if you don't know about this guy, I can only really describe him as being the Kanye of the underground. He's definitely very influential, very important, but completely off his rocker. Although at the time, he wasn't as crazy, or at least maybe hit it better. And during 2011, he would drop one of the most influential projects of all time when it came to the underground called Blackland Radio 66.6. And this project would go on to change everything, basically creating that sound that we now heavily associate with Florida, but not long after that, Space Ghost Perp would leave and go to New York to hang out with the ASAP Mob. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail of what went down in New York because Space Ghost Perp is his own entire rabbit hole that I can't get too much into here, so for now, all you really need to know is that he fell out with ASAP Mob and then returned to Florida. And when news spread the Space Ghost Perp was going to be returning to his home state and starting up his own rap collective known as Raider Clan, everybody was pretty eager to join, and of course, Denzel Curry was one of those members. With the two initially getting connected through Mike Deese, and here we go again, Mike Deese is coming back to haunt me, but either way, Mike Deese would reach out to Space Ghost Perp to ask if Denzel and him could hop on a track together. After that, Denzel would then agree to make artwork for a couple of Perp songs before finally getting on a FaceTime call and asking Perp if he could join Raider Clan, which of course Perp would agree to. And this is really the true beginning of Denzel Curry's career because he would immediately start dropping mixtapes with the group, with the first one being called King Remembered Underground Tape 1991 to 1995. This project had some pretty decent features from Young Simi, another member of Raider Clan, as well as Mike Deese. Apparently he's not going to go away at this point. On top of that, it was also heavily influenced by 3-6 Mafia and that entire funk sound that was coming out of Memphis at the time, as well as being a tribute artist to DJ Screw, the guy who created that whole chopped and screwed type of sound. And overall, this project was a pretty big success, with Denzel and Raider Clan starting to get their first little bit of traction in the underground scene, eventually starting to play shows at warehouses as well as house parties, and starting to get their name out there. And this group would also spawn the careers of Eddie Baker, Chris Travis, and Xavier Wolf, who would all eventually leave and start up their own group with another artist known as Bones called Sesh Hollow Water Boys, which in itself is an incredibly influential group in the underground scene, so it just goes to show how influential Raider Clan itself was, and of course, it would only help Denzel get bigger and bigger, with him dropping another project called King of the Mischievous South Volume 1 Underground Tape 1996, which had even more features from artists like Ruben Slick, Little Ugly Mane, and of course, Space Ghost Perp. And it's also around the time that Denzel would discover Puya and Fat Nick, finding their YouTube series and reaching out to them to tell them how much he really liked it, and then Puya would ask if he could drive out and film a couple vlogs for him, which of course, Denzel gladly accepted. So in a weird roundabout way, Denzel put Puya on, who would then go on to put Suicide Boys and Ghostmane on, so basically what I'm saying is Denzel Curry is the father of the underground, although he never tries to take credit for that, unlike somebody like Puya. And after forming that connection, Denzel would decide to finally start to move away from Raider Clan. There was no beef or really any reason for it besides the fact that he didn't want to be overshadowed by the group anymore and wanted to prove to everybody that he could be his own solo artist. But before he left, he would drop one more tape called Only for My Riders. This project was meant to pay tribute to Trayvon Martin, a Florida teenager who was unfortunately gunned down by a police officer in an arrest gone wrong. And the story hit Denzel so close, with him not being able to imagine something like that happening to one of his own family members or even him, with this project overall serving as a very ominous foreshadowing of events that would transpire in 2014. But for now, with Denzel stepping away from Raider Clan, he only had one focus, and that was working on his first official studio album known as Nostalgia 64. Now, the meaning of studio album is a little bit different here than what it usually means by today's standards. Usually nowadays, if you put out a studio album, it means you have a label backing you, but Denzel would actually go to the studio himself, tap in with the producer, and put it together all himself completely independently. And around the same time that he was working on this project, he would also start performing at a lot more professional venues like the Boiler Room, alongside acts like Rob Banks and other important members of the underground scene. And if you happen to be lucky enough to go to one of these underground shows, you might have got the chance to listen to Nostalgia 64 early, because Denzel was actually handing out rare demos of the tape that he would also give to radio stations, because back then, radio play was a lot more important than it is now. And this all led up to the project finally releasing in September 2013 to massive success. It seems like a lot of his fans really showed up for the project, and a couple articles online would even call it one of the best albums of the entire year, which is pretty impressive considering how underground he was at the time. And the features themselves were also pretty impressive, getting a bunch of returning Raider Clan members to appear on the project, as well as getting JK the Reaper and Rob Banks. So overall, the project was very successful, and it helped Denzel shake off those past allegations that he was only a mixtape rapper and he could only make music with Raider Clan and couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. He had finally proven that he could do that, and he was one of the biggest artists in Florida because of that. So at this point, you're probably thinking he's doing really well, he's making some money off of his music, performing, getting more fans. It's probably time for him to move to LA and really make a go at the industry and break through into the mainstream. Although keep in mind, this was 2013 and the underground scene was still only in its infancy, so even though Denzel Curry was a pretty big artist by underground standards, he was nowhere near the mainstream quite yet. But luckily for him, once 2014 started to roll around, things would only get bigger for the SoundCloud wave, with him finally starting to put his music on there and a bunch of new artists breaking onto the scene. Although when it came to Denzel's personal life, it was actually his most haunting and confusing year of all time, because unfortunately his older brother, Trayon Johnson, would get into an altercation with a police officer where he ended up getting tased, and unfortunately that taser would pierce his liver, leading poison to leak into his body, and eventually led to his untimely death. And just like that, Denzel's worst nightmare had taken place. His older brother had passed away in a police altercation, which he had actually foreshadowed in his prior project, and he would start to spiral out, doing a bunch of psychedelics, getting into a toxic relationship, and basically shutting down. However, surprisingly, with everything going on in his life, he ended up going to South by Southwest only about a month after his brother passed away, and he even did a small interview where he seemed to be in at least okay spirits, so it shows that Denzel is very hard-headed and strong-willed and was able to make his way through this tragedy. However, there wouldn't be a new project from him throughout the entire year 2014. This could have been because of the tragedy. It could have been because he went to art school. He did speak about going to art school at one point, but I'm not sure exactly where that fits in the timeline. Or maybe he was just trying to take the extra time to make sure that the next project that he put out was really special and something groundbreaking and life-changing for him. It's hard to say exactly what happened, but either way, he was quiet throughout most of the year. However, when he did finally return in 2015, we would get a double feature called 32 Zell slash Shrooms, which was basically two different albums put together with two very different vibes. 32 Zell was a lot more of that classic sound that fans have become accustomed to, where Shrooms was a lot more psychedelic and sounded a lot more like Outkast than anything actually hip-hop related, which was a pretty bold move for Denzel considering he could have kept making the same type of music forever and definitely built a fan base off of that, but he was an artist who was willing to try something different, and of course when he tried something different, his fans absolutely hated it. They thought it was too different, they thought it was too weird and out there, but as the years went on, it's definitely grown on people, kind of like A Whole Lot of Red with Playboi Carti. It's that sleeper album that a lot of people didn't appreciate at the time, but as the years went on, it aged better and better. But apparently Denzel didn't feel the same way, because he actually ended up taking down Zell 32, leading a lot of fans to wonder why he would take down the project that they seemed to like better than the other one. But it mostly came down to the fact that he was trying to sign a record deal around the time, and apparently they wanted to take down the project and rework it and put it out in a more professional way. But that would all go down in 2016. For now, in 2015, Denzel had just broken up with a girlfriend and decided to change up his entire life, moving into a place called the ULT House with people from Metro Zoo, as well as the infamous rap producer Ronnie J. And Denzel would spend most of his time here drinking, writing on the walls, making different types of artwork, and of course, working on music, as well as throwing many parties with a lot of underground rappers from the Florida area coming to perform. And at one of these parties, two very infamous rappers in the underground Florida scene would appear, known as Ski Mask the Slump God and XXX Tentacion. Now, initially, they weren't even supposed to be there. They were accidentally invited to perform, but it turns out that Denzel didn't approve of that. Initially, Denzel was going to kick them out of the party, but after getting to know them and talking to them for a while, he decided to let them stay, and he would form a connection with them shortly after that. After that, Denzel and X kept running into each other at different places, building their connection day by day, to the point that X was pulling up to the UTL house almost every single day to record music, and eventually, Denzel decided to just let him full-on move in because he wanted him to stay out of trouble with crime and the police. Which would work out for a while, but before long, X would start to get get into trouble again because, after all, X was basically always in trouble throughout his entire life. But despite that, they would make some pretty good music together, including the infamous diss track Space Goes Pussy, which you could probably guess who that's aimed at. Now, I bet you're wondering why Denzel decided to make a diss track on Space Goes Perp. After all, when he left Raider Clan, he left on good terms, and they never seemed to have any beef, but it all came down to the fact that Space Goes Perp and his homie Chapo were dissing a deceased rap producer known as ASAP Yams, and apparently Denzel took that very seriously. After all, his brother passed away, and he had a lot of dead people around him, and in his opinion, nobody should ever diss somebody who can't defend themselves. So Denzel Curry would get both XXX and Tentacion and Ski Mask Slump God to hop on a diss track with him aimed at Perp, and apparently X also took this very to heart, being very aggressive in his verse and continuing to diss Space Goes Perp for the years to come. Eventually, Denzel and Perp would end up making up, but X hated Perp until the day that he died, making several diss tracks, including one called Sipping Tea in Your Hood, and apparently he wasn't too happy with Denzel for becoming friends with Perp again, but we don't really know what happened with that because, after all, X has passed away now. But if you're at all feeling bad for Space Goes Perp in this situation, seeing as how 3 rappers teamed up on him, I wouldn't really feel too bad because he ended up making fun of X after he passed away as well, so he never learned his lesson, and to this day, he's still one of the most unhinged and insane rappers to ever live. After that, 2015 would end off, and 2016 would get off to a start with Denzel signing a record deal with a company called Loma Vista. They seem to be a pretty small independent record company, and I'm pretty sure he only signed with them for a distribution deal, so before you freak out and say he sold out by not being independent anymore, he still had full control over his music, and he would continue to make the stuff that he wanted to make. And after signing the deal with them, he'd put out his sophomore album called Imperial, which housed one of the biggest songs that he ever created in his entire career, known as Ultimate. Now, if you were around in 2016, you definitely heard this song. It became very popular on Vine, with people mostly using it to represent somebody doing something really badass, and because of that, it would eventually become a meme and spread even further, which was both good and bad because in one way, Denzel was getting bigger than he ever was before, but at the same time, he was basically being made fun of, and a lot of people who listened to the song didn't even know it came from Denzel in the first place, so it was kind of a double-edged sword, with the track eventually getting so big that he couldn't possibly follow it up, and it would start to eclipse his entire career, making him seem like a meme or a joke rapper. But besides that, the rest of Imperial was also pretty good, with Joey Badass appearing on it as well as Rick Ross, showing that Denzel was starting to move into a more mainstream type of sound, as well as moving to LA and even making his way onto one of the best XXL freshman lists of all time, the 2016 Cypher Baby. We already know it: Kodak Black, Lil Uzi Vert, Lil Yachty, and of course, Denzel Curry. Oh yeah, and 21 Savage was also there, I almost forgot, but either way, they ended up doing a cypher that became legendary. Even to this day, people still talk about it, and because of that, it felt like all 5 of these guys were going to become the biggest rappers in the game, which eventually kind of came true. I mean, Uzi would go on to get tons of hit songs, drop massive projects, and eventually become the father of the new wave. You got 21 Savage working with Drake and becoming a big deal in that way. Kodak Black ended up dropping a massive hit with ZZ, and now he's basically always in the news for either antics or sometimes his music. And then you got Lil Yachty, who's basically ruined every feature he's ever done in the past 4 years and is basically a tumor on the entire rap game, but either way, he's a big deal. But then you got Denzel Curry, who ended up having a pretty rampant fan base. He had one big song with Ultimate, but besides that, he didn't have any chart hits, and he never really got as big as the other 4, leading a lot of people to wonder why. And this would include Denzel himself, because he started to feel very bad about all his peers starting to surpass him, Ultimate getting bigger and bigger and making him look like more and more of a joke. So at this point, you might think he'd walk away from rap altogether, but instead he did the exact opposite, really tapping in and getting to work on one of his biggest projects of all time. And this project was a massive 3-part masterpiece that would eventually change his entire persona in the rap game, although we would have to wait an entire year for it to come out, because during 2017, he was once again pretty quiet. He would drop a project called 13, which was a bit of a smaller EP, as well as re-releasing 32 Zell, which once again had a couple different songs on it, so it was kind of a new project, but more of the same at the same time. But during this period, even though he wasn't releasing a lot of music, he would start to work on himself, sobering up and getting away from drugs, leaving LA for a little bit to go back to Florida and tap back in with his roots, and of course put a ton of work into Taboo, which was a very smart idea by him, because by late 2017, the whole Lay Sam pandemic would start to break out, with a lot of rappers passing away, including Lil Peep, which completely changed the entire narrative about drug use online. And Denzel ended up being a pretty big part of this, because unlike somebody like Russ that was basically wagging his finger and telling kids not to do drugs anymore because it was dangerous, Denzel would have a more level-headed take on it and lead a lot of people away from that dark lifestyle. I mean, I guess you could say that bro was really starting to get that unk status, am I right? No? Okay, let's move on. After that, he would then finish off 2017 by going to Rolling Loud and performing alongside X before seeing him one last time in Florida in the summer 2018, right before he unfortunately passed away. It turns out that Denzel was talking to X around the time, telling him to get out of Florida, get away from the people that he was around, and try to clear his mind in a whole new space, but unfortunately, that advice wouldn't get to X at the right time. And after that, we already know what happened, so we don't have to rehash it. But either way, it was a very strange time for Denzel in his life because on one hand, one of his friends had just passed away, but on the other hand, he was about to put out his magnum opus project, Taboo, which had one track on it known as Cloud Cobain, which would eventually become an even bigger hit than Ultimate and finally reestablish Denzel as a respected artist that should be paid attention to. It also came along with a very iconic music video where Denzel was dressed up as a clown performing in a circus with a bunch of fans surrounding him and all encouraging him to take his own life, which at the time was very meaningful because during the late SoundCloud wave after people like X and Pete passed away, a lot of people were heavily fetishizing their death and talking about how majestic it was and beautiful that they passed so young, and Denzel wanted to say something about it without shoving it down your throat. And I don't think this video will ever get old because every year more and more rappers pass away, and no matter when you watch it, you can really get the meaning behind it and interpret it in a different way, so he definitely made some timeless art with that one. There was also another track off this album called Vengeance, which had a feature from both JPEG Mafia as well as Zilla Kami, with the two of them becoming close friends and appearing in interviews together from time to time. They would even practice Muay Thai together and seem to be pretty close friends, not to mention that Denzel basically gave Zilla credentials in the rap game, but as we already know in 2024, Zilla would unfortunately throw that all away. But it is nice to see that Denzel was still willing to put newer artists on even in 2018 after he had already reached his peak and become one of the biggest artists in the game. Although, as I said, 2018 was basically his peak. I mean, people absolutely love Taboo, don't get me wrong, and of course, Club Cobain would eventually get bigger than Ultimate, meaning that he was able to earn his respect back in the game and this time for the right reasons, but he still remained pretty underrated and still somewhat underground. Although at this point, I do think that Denzel had made peace with it. I don't think he wanted to be the biggest rapper in the world and wanted to have the complete creative control over his music, so he never sold his soul and never signed with the labels, which meant he still had the freedom to do weird and wacky stuff, and that's exactly what he would do in the following years. In 2019, we get another project by him called Zoo, which in my opinion was a return to form and had a little bit less cultural impact than Taboo, but was still pretty good at the same time. This album also included another big hit for Denzel called Ricky, which was named after his father, as well as having a music video for the track where he would show himself in a backyard boxing match meant to pay respects to his fallen brother. And while this track didn't end up charting on the Billboard Hot 100, the album itself actually would, and on top of that, he would also attend Grade A for the first time in 2019. While on this tour, he would perform alongside acts like Suicide Boys, Shoreline Mafia, and City Morgue, which were all pretty big at the time, but once 2020 rolled around, they all got a lot bigger after the pandemic hit, and when it came to Denzel, he wouldn't stop dropping music either. We got a small EP on SoundCloud and YouTube called Blood In, Blood Out, which he actually announced all the way back in 2018, but only officially released in 2020. And this might be controversial, but this is actually my all-time favorite mixtape by Denzel. I really like Evil Twins with him and Zilla Kami. In fact, it's probably my favorite song that the two ever put out together, as well as Charlie Sheen featuring Ghostmane. Overall, it's really solid, and I feel like it's heavily underrated when people talk about the entire discography of Denzel Curry, so if you haven't listened to it yet, I would definitely give it a try. I think you might like it. But honestly, that mixtape was only a serving platter what was to come because the big project that Denzel was going to put out in 2020 was called Unlocked, featuring Kenny Beats. Now, if you were online in any capacity during that time, there's no way you missed this project. It came out right before the pandemic, which was probably the perfect time for it to come out because this was an extremely experimental album and completely different than anything else he's put out in the past because it basically served as a multi-medium comic book in a way. Every single song on the project connected together in one big story, and every song also got an animated music video, which initially was supposed to be even more ambitious with 3D animation and different styles for every single one, but of course Denzel had to rein himself back a little bit when the actual project came out. But even though it didn't end up becoming the full scope of what he wanted for the project, when it did release, a lot of people were very impressed that he was willing to try something so different, and it goes to show that even 10 years into his career, he was still willing to be creative and try different things. In the following year, 2021, Denzel wouldn't drop any new music, probably because he was working on his next big studio album called Melt My Eyes, See Your Future, which has so many features on it I can't even list them all. But a few of the notable ones would be Josiah, GID, and Rico Nasty, showing that Denzel Denzel was still willing to put on smaller artists without boasting about it too much like other people that we know. Not to mention that 2022 was also the year that Denzel would finally get a Lyrical Lemonade video, which, let's be honest, probably should have happened about 4 to 6 years before that point, but either way, he had finally made his way on there and it was long past overdue. And he would even make it onto the Lyrical Lemonade album in 2024, which wasn't the best project, but either way, I am happy to see that Lyrical Lemonade is willing to put a spotlight on these older underground artists that definitely deserve to be exposed to the newer generation, like Corbin, Black Cray, and of course, Denzel himself. And this all led up to 2024 when he would put out his next project, King of the Mischievous South Part 2, which honestly is kind of surprising that he would put out a Part 2 to a project that came out over 12 years ago, but he described in an interview that it was basically meant to be a project that would represent what could have been if Raider Clan had stayed together and ASAP Mob had never had beef with them, so it's a pretty cool idea overall, and as of right now, it's looking like another classic from Denzel with the deluxe on the way, and with all that said, that's basically the entire story of Denzel Curry up to date, well, at least everything that I could cover in a probably 30-minute video, because let's be honest, there's so much to this guy that you could probably do a 3-hour video. To finish off, I gotta give Denzel his props, he's definitely an underground legend at this point, and some would even consider him the king of the underground, with him pioneering so many different styles that would eventually become popular with different artists in the mainstream, but despite that, he's never really been able to pass through fully, but at this point, I feel like everything's changing in the music industry, because it seems like that wall between the mainstream and the underground scene is finally starting to break down, and it really all comes down to how much money you have to promote yourself and push yourself as far as you possibly can, so somebody like Denzel is finally getting the respect that he deserves all this time later. I think in the following years, we're going to see the mainstream and the underground scene basically amalgamate into one thing, with those terms starting to fall out of favor and it just becoming the overall music industry, because after all, you don't have to have plaques and hit songs on the billboard to still be a very talented and accomplished artist, and I think Denzel Curry is the perfect example of that, so I gotta give a shout out to him, and a shout out to you guys too for watching all the way through. Really hope you guys enjoyed the video, and before we close off, I just want to give a shout out to my Patreons. We got Liam Campbell, William Collins, Crusader Official, and a brand new Patreon named Matthew, so thank you very much for signing up, it really helps out the channel. And with all that said, shout out to Knife Gang, thanks for watching all the way through. Sorry if I sound a little bit messed up in this video, I'm kinda sick, but either way, it's a good one. Knife Gang, we're out. Peace.